Howdy friends, I'm Gene Hawkins and I'm here today to take you on a journey through 80 years of the history of the MUTCD. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am an associate professor in the Zachary Department of Civil Engineering at Texas A&M University, and I also have a joint appointment with the Texas A&M Transportation Institute. I grew up learning how to read by looking at traffic signs, which my father sometimes brought home because he was a traffic engineer. And so I grew up with traffic engineering in my blood, and when he entered retirement, I obtained all of his old traffic engineering reference documents, and that started me on a lifelong journey of collecting old and historical traffic engineering documents, including the MUTCD. The MUTCD was approved as an American standard on November 7, 1935. And so this month we are celebrating the 80th birthday of the document, and that gave me a really good excuse to take a PowerPoint presentation that I've been giving to audiences for about 20 years and make that a video that I'm able to share with you today. Now, the manual is more appropriately known as the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It is arguably the most important traffic engineering document that exists. It is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations as a national standard for all traffic control devices used on roads open to public travel, which includes both private and public roads. And the 862 pages in the 2009 edition, which is the current edition, contain a great deal of information about the meaning, design, selection, installation, operation, and maintenance of traffic control devices. And it has a long history. There have been 10 different editions of the MUTCD. It started with the original 1935 edition. There was another edition put out at the beginning of World War II, the post-war edition. Then early in the 60s, 1961 edition, early in the 70s, a 1971 edition, an edition in 1978, another one in 1988, the 2000 edition, the 2003 edition, and then our current 2009 edition. Now, the history that goes into the MUTCD actually goes back all the way to the days of the Roman Empire, when they would mark these stone columns on the side of roads with the distance to Rome, which was obviously the center of the Roman Empire. And even in colonial America, they would put up these road markers that would show the distance to significant cities. Now, of course, they didn't have paved streets and sidewalks and traffic signs and signals like you see in this picture, but this is an example of the type of colonial America road marker that might be on the side of a trail. And then automobile travel began in the early part of the 20th century. And as the number of automobiles increased, the need for more detailed and more useful traffic control devices grew. Traffic signals and control at intersections was a big part of this early need for traffic control devices. When there were relatively limited number of vehicles, they would put police officers in the center of the intersection, and they would hold up various types of semaphores and other signals that would be on a post, and you could see the word go from one street, and on the crossing street it would say stop, and the police officer simply rotated that 90 degrees back and forth to control the traffic at the intersection. The earliest signals were used in London, England, and used semaphores such as shown on the left. And then as the system progressed, we began to adopt some of the electrical indications that were used on railroads. And so we started seeing the red and green indications and the semaphore flags. And a lot of these were in towers or mounted on posts on the side of the road. In order to help the police officers see the traffic on the four approaches to an intersection, they started putting them in towers. And some of these towers were relatively low to the ground, others were really high. Some of them were real simple, others were very ornate. The signals were typically incorporated into the tower, and the police officers simply stood in the tower and looked at the traffic on each of the roads and decided when to change the signal for a given road from red to green and vice versa. Now, I said red and green because in many of the early signals, those were the only two colors that were used, and they weren't always round indications either. Sometimes they were rectangular, sometimes they were square. You can see here that some of them had word messages, some of them included a yellow interval, and some of them did not. So in the early part of the 20th century, all the way into the 20s and 30s, there was no standardization of traffic signal design. Some of them had large numbers of indications. Some of them used combinations of semaphores and signal lights. And the position of the different colors was not even standardized. And sometimes you saw red on top, sometimes green was on top. Traffic signs likewise were not very uniform. The appearance of a sign took on whatever the designer of that sign, essentially the person that painted the sign, whatever they wanted it to look like is how they ended up painting it. And so it was not unusual to see words like warning or caution or danger on many of the early signs. And in fact, police departments actually were responsible for many of the early traffic signs that were put out on roadways. And some of them contain a great deal of information, more than you could read as you were driving by. In fact, this Connecticut sign, the expectation was that you would park on the side of the road, get out of your vehicle, walk up to the sign, and read all of the state laws regarding motor vehicle operation before you would proceed into the state. And many of these signs were not beyond putting some rather graphic messages on them, such as the danger, go slow. And I mentioned police departments doing a lot of the signing. Automobile clubs also did a lot of the signing in many areas. And it wasn't until Michigan, which is the M29, state of Michigan was one of the very early states to start standardizing the design of traffic signs throughout the state. And in the lower right, you see a number of standard sign designs that were developed in Idaho in the 1920s. And again, many of them say caution and danger. Some of the most hazardous conditions that existed during this time were actually at the railroad grade crossings. And those existed because there were a large number of trains. In fact, train travel was the predominant way of moving from one city to another back in this era. And so you would see a lot of messages that would say, look, listen, death, stop, skull and crossbones. And then as more and more experience was gained with traffic control devices, we started seeing some movement toward more consistent devices and creation of new devices. For example, as best I can determine, the very first center line that was ever used on a road was used in 1911 in Michigan. Now, this picture isn't necessarily that application, but it illustrates what center lines looked like in that era. One of the earliest, if not the first, traffic signal was installed in Cleveland. And it wasn't until 1920 that the first three-color, the red, the yellow, and the green, traffic signal was installed in Detroit. One of the very first efforts toward standardization of traffic control devices occurred in 1923 when the Mississippi Valley Association of State Highway Departments came up with recommendations for the shape of signs. And their basic concept was that the number of sides on a sign represented the hazard level. And if you remember, I had said that railroad grade crossings represented the most hazardous condition at that time in that era. And so What they said is a sign with an infinite number of sides, which is a circle, would be used to represent railroad grade crossings. And then the 8-sided sign, which is our stop sign, would be used to represent intersections where a stop is required. And then a diamond shape with 4 sides would be a warning indicating a speed reduction. A square that had 4 sides would be a caution condition, which is a hazard that the driver needed to be aware of, but that did not require a speed reduction. And then rectangular shape would be used for directions or some sort of regulation. And then a year later, the National Conference on Street and Highway Safety came up with color recommendations. And they applied to both signs and to signals where red means stop, green means proceed, yellow means caution, white would be for directions or distance, and they recommended purple as an indication of an intersection. Now, that's the one color that ended up not ever really being implemented. And then for the 3rd year in a row, 1925, there was another effort toward standardization. It was contained in the Joint Board Report on Interstate Highways, which was led by the American Association of State Highway Officials, which is now known as AASHTO. And it recommended where the highways that would be part of the United States highway system be located. And it also included some recommendations for standard signs. This was an appendix in the back, and you can see images of the signs that were recommended as part of that. Those sign recommendations then evolved into an AASHTO publication, which represented the very first national manual of any type on traffic control devices. It only addressed signs and only for rural areas, and the title of that was Manufacturing Specifications for the Manufacture, Display, and Erection of U.S. Standard Road Markers and Signs. And when they say road markers, they were not talking about pavement markings, but U.S. route markers. These are examples of the signs that were presented in that document. It included the stop sign, the grade crossing sign, which had the plus symbol on it as opposed to the more common one we see today. It included some work zone type signs and warning signs for various conditions that included both words and symbols, because the concern was that people would not understand what the symbols meant. And of course, the U.S. highway route marker that we all know, the R underneath that route marker was intended to convey that in order to stay on that particular highway, in this case Highway 56 in Kansas, you would have to turn right at the next intersection. And all of these signs used what was called a block letter alphabet or block letter font, which is a very square shaped design for the individual letters. And that was used because these signs at the time were fabricated from a sheet of steel that then was stamped with the letters. So the letters and the border were embossed on the signs. And then once they were embossed, the entire sign was dipped in a vat of yellow paint, and that's how it became yellow or white for the route markers and speed limit signs. And then it went through a roller with black ink on the roller that would put the color on the legend and the border of the sign. And most of these signs had a maximum size of 24 inches. And then because that manual had addressed only rule conditions, another group that was sponsored by the National Conference on Street and Highway Safety came up with a manual for urban conditions. Now this one addressed more than just signs. It also addressed markings and signals, but it specifically dealt with urban areas, and it was titled Manual on Street Traffic Signs, Signals, and Markings. And the signs in that particular manual were very similar to those in the rule manual, but there were some differences. For example, the stop sign used a red legend on a yellow background instead of the black that was used in the rule areas. Now, the railroad signs were the same. You notice the two horizontal lines on this one. The reason there's two lines there is because that was intended to represent a location that had two railroad tracks, whereas the sign that I showed you previously only had one railroad track. Well, now we had a manual for rural conditions and a different one for urban conditions, and that created some challenges. And so they created a joint committee, these two groups, ASHO and the National Conference on Street and Highway Safety, and together that joint committee developed the 1935 Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, our very first MUTCD. And when it was first published in 1935, and that is an image of the actual 1935 manual, it was mimeographed. It was a very crude publication. And then in 1937, it was republished as a typeset document. And then there was a revision to it, and the revision was only a few pages, and that revision was published in 1939. Now, the content of this first MUTCD said that signs were either white or yellow, and it defined shapes for signs that were either diamond, square, circle, octagon, or rectangle, and I've already talked about what most of those shapes related to. Markings could be white, yellow, or black, whichever color provided the most contrast on that pavement. But the 1935 manual did do one important thing for setting standards, and that is it defined a three-color signal as the only acceptable design for a traffic signal. And these are a few of the signs that were included in the 1935 manual. Now, in these images, you'll see many of the signs have little white or red circles in them. Those were the retroreflective elements of these signs. The signs were actually made, again, steel, mostly embossed, that just was painted. And the only way you could see them at night were these cat's eyes, which is essentially a marble element that would reflect light back to the driver. And they outlined the shape of the signs because the idea was the drivers would know what to do in response to the sign once they figured out what the shape of the sign is. Only a very few legends were actually had the cat's eyes in them. And then, beginning of World War II, there were many challenges associated with traffic control during wartime conditions. And so they published the War Emergency Edition of the MUTCD. And the primary change from the previous version that was in this manual is that it dealt with conservation of materials, so it allowed agencies to leave devices out longer than maybe they should have in order to conserve materials. And it added a section on traffic control during blackout conditions. And the blackout conditions essentially meant that you drove your vehicle with most of the headlight covered up, only a small slit to allow light to escape. Traffic signals were operated at about 20% of the voltage that they would normally use. And so it was very difficult to see. In fact, during blackout conditions, before you would actually start driving your vehicle, you're supposed to sit in it for about 20 minutes to allow your eyes to adjust to the dark conditions. And so with signs, they would take the legend of the sign and put it as a separate legend copy lower on the post and do something to make it retroreflective. At intersections, they would put the cone type markings in the intersection and put an X on the approach to the intersection so that you would know you were coming up to an intersection. With the end of World War II, traffic engineers began working on a new version of the MUTCD, and it was published in 1948. It represented a significant rewrite from what really was a 1935 MUTCD. And in this new manual, there were a lot of changes to traffic signs. They simplified the legends that were in a large number of traffic signs. The caution sign that had been square that was in the 1935 and 1942 MUTCDs was deleted from the manual. They did add the square advisory speed plaque, and this is the little sign below a curve sign that tells you what speed is recommended for that curve. And they changed from the block letter alphabet that I had been talking about earlier to a rounded letter alphabet. And this was possible because at this point in time, they had moved away from embossing signs and were instead painting the letters on retroreflective sheeting as opposed to embossing them in the steel. They made a number of changes to pavement markings. They started to define that the color yellow would be used only for a double center line or for the solid yellow line that indicates the no passing zone, and that everywhere else white was to be used. And the edge lines that we see today are actually not recommended in the 1948 MUTCD. And this manual also simplified the signal warrants that had been in the previous editions to make them a little more usable. And the 48 manual was revised one time, 1954, but that was a very significant revision, and I'll talk about that in a couple of slides. Now here are a number of the signs that were in the 1948 MUTCD. It was at this point in time that the signs started taking on the appearance that looks so familiar to us today. The style of the letters is very consistent with the style. In fact, it's the same style that we use today. We still were pretty much limited to either yellow signs with black legends or black and white signs, either white background or black background. We did not have the green or the brown or the blue or red colors that we see today. In fact, as indicated here, stop signs continue to be yellow. Now, before and even after the publication of the 1948 MUTCD, we started seeing quite a variety in the appearance of stop signs. And this slide illustrates many of the early stop signs. The one in the center that says stop ordnance corner that looks like a coffin, I've been told is how stop signs got their early sign shape, because this was a very early version of the sign. You can see it was installed by the AAA. And that because it was so large and took up so much space, they just started making it shorter and shorter to where it became an even octagon. Most of these early yellow stop signs had some sort of secondary message. You can see some of them say through street. It was not unusual to say dead end or through highway or blind corner or some other message on it. Some of these signs had a black band with white letters, and the white letters were all that was retroreflective. Some of them had the red cat's eyes. Some of them had a retroreflective background. Some of them used red within the sign in some manner. So quite a variety in the appearance of stop signs. And then it was also in the early 50s when a few agencies started experimenting with the concept of a yield sign, where a stop wasn't required. You just needed to slow down, and if there was a conflict, you had to yield the right of way to the conflicting vehicle. And those started out with this keystone shape that you see in the lower right corner. And then in 1954, there was a revision to the 1948 MUTCD, and it was in this revision that they changed the color of the stop sign from yellow to red. They also eliminated the use of secondary messages within the legend of a stop sign. And a brand new sign, the yield sign, was introduced in the 1954 revision. However, even though we started seeing these movements toward standardization of many devices, there were still a great number of what you could call non-standard signals and other devices that continued to be used throughout the 50s, the 60s. I've even heard stories of some being used into the 70s. For example, on the left you see a Darley two-bulb signal. And if you notice, for one roadway, the top indication is red, for the other is green. That's because there's only two bulbs in this signal head. And so when the top bulb is on, it showed red to one street, green to the other. And then the lower bulb came on, those colors were reversed. And the clearance or change interval was indicated by having both bulbs on at the same time. In the center, you see a Wiley traffic signal, which was used on the West Coast, and it had not only the red and the green indications, but also a word stop or go. And in New York City, they had what they called the olive traffic signals, which were simply a red and a green indication. As I said, many of these continued in use for many years beyond the point in which the MUTCD had recommended a different standard application. And also during the 1950s, we started seeing the growth of the interstate highway system, and with that came the demand for improved traffic signing and pavement marking for these highways because they were high speed, long distance travel. And so the Bureau of Public Roads started doing research in the early to mid 50s, and most of that was published in the mid to late 50s, dealing with issues like pavement markings and freeway guide signs. And in this particular case, and these pictures are actually from those tests, the BPR evaluated different types of guide sign designs, different colors, different letter styles, and some of the other signs, and came up with recommendations for how to do signing on the new interstate highways. And that research led to an AASHTO Interstate Manual for Signs and Markings. And this manual was first published in 1958, and that is where we got the use of green for traffic signs, because it introduced the white on green guide signs. This is the first time we started seeing lowercase letters used in traffic signs. It also recommended guide sign or service signs that used a green letter on a white background. It recommended much larger sign sizes because of the higher speeds. And then when the document was revised in 1961, those service signs that had been green on white went to white on blue. And it was revised again in 62, and then the final version of it was published in 1970. And this is what those initial signs in the 1958 manual looked like. This is the document that introduced the interstate route shield that we know today. And then in later revisions, they added the U.S. Interstate Business Road, which is the interstate shield, but it has a green background. They improved the design of the freeway guide signs. They changed the color warning signs to actual yellow and the service signs to blue. And then in 1961, we got a new edition of the MUTCD. This is the very first edition for which the federal government required compliance with the MUTCD on any federal aid highway. And it added some new material. It is the first MUTCD that had a separate part to deal with construction or work zone traffic control. Remember, this is during the Cold War era, and so there's a new part in there dealing with civil defense signing, and basically that's how you evacuate an area when you have a nuclear attack. And there were signs about civil defense shelters and checkpoints and things like that. And it added a lot of the content from the 1958 AASHTO manual dealing with freeway guide signs. And this particular picture indicates pavement markings that were common at this point in time, which the yellow barrier line that indicates no passing, but the white broken center line. And here's a few of those signs. The yield sign changed. They took out the words right of way, and it's just a yellow yield sign. We started in this manual seeing the transition from the old style of U.S. route marker that had the state and U.S. on it to the modern style that just had the highway number. We started seeing more symbol signs, and of course, as I mentioned, the civil defense signs. There were no revisions to the 1961 manual. Instead, traffic engineers began working immediately toward publication of the new manual, which came out in 1971. It was a very significant change from the 61 manual, It is the very first MUTCD which the federal government assumed ownership of, and they did that right after it was published. And it had more new content. It added material dealing with school areas. It introduced the color orange for use in temporary traffic control in work zones. It added new sign shapes for the no passing zone pennant and the pentagon for school area signs. It introduced a large number of symbol signs, and a big part of the decade of the 60s was spent doing research on symbol signs for this MUTCD. It also changed the rules for pavement markings to say that yellow would be used to separate opposing directions of traffic flow, and so all center lines became yellow in this manual. It was actually revised 8 times, and these 8 revisions were small pamphlets that listed what the revision was. Now, having 8 revisions out there created some problems, and the problem was that people were not keeping their manuals up to date with all of these changes, and so by the mid-70s, no one really had a good idea of exactly what the MUTCD content was unless they had taken every one of these revisions and then made the appropriate notes within their original 1971 MUTCD. Now here are signs that were added to, revised, or somehow addressed in the 1971 manual. So we saw the introduction of red beyond just the use in stop signs. The yield sign changed from yellow to the red and white. We saw red for do not enter signs and the red circle and slash for prohibition signs. We saw, as I mentioned, orange for construction and work zone signs. A lot of symbol signs. We did not use symbols for everything, though. We came up with a signal or a symbol for the signal ahead sign, but at the time we were worried about putting a red octagon within a warning sign, and so we kept the word legend for the stop ahead condition. And as I said, introduced the pentagon and the pennant shape. Because of all of the out-of-date MUTCDs that I mentioned, they published the 1978 manual, which was really a 1971 manual with all of the revisions incorporated into it. And because of the challenges of keeping the 71 manual up to date, with this manual they went from the perfect bound version that all the previous manuals had been to a binder format. It came in a 3-ring binder, and the idea was anytime a revision was made, they would just reprint that page, and then you could put it into your binder so you could have an up-to-date manual. Remember, this is before the days of the internet. Now, the 78 manual did add some new content dealing with railroad highway grade crossings and with bicycle facilities. And it also again changed the rules for pavement markings, and it stated that yellow markings would be on the left side of the road. And it was revised 4 times, and in each of those 4 revisions, they reprinted the effective pages and shipped those to subscribers to insert into their MUTCD. Here are a number of new signs that were added in the 1978 manual. We added several more symbol signs. We added some signs for preferential lanes and bicycle lanes. Finally decided that, you know what, drivers are not going to be confused by a red octagon in a yellow diamond, and so we did that. And you see some sign symbols that were on there, for example, the pavement end signs that looks like the end of a cigarette and the narrow bridge sign. Those have been found to not be very well understood by drivers and have actually been removed from more recent editions of the MUTCD. Now again, because we had out-of-date MUTCDs, because not everyone was a subscriber to the MUTCD updates, the decision was made to revise the manual again. It came out in 1988. It was essentially a 1978 MUTCD with all 4 of the previous revisions incorporated, plus a few additional revisions that were revision number 5. That revision number 5 did add some new content: recreational cultural signs, logo signs, and tourist-oriented directional signs. The idea was that the 1988 manual would only be revised for safety reasons. We wanted to keep the revisions down to a minimum so that there would not be all of these out-of-date manuals. And what happened? Well, the 1988 manual was revised 7 times during its life. A significant revision was published in 1993, and it revised the entire Part 6 portion of the 1988 MUTCD. And Part 6 is the temporary traffic control work zone construction area. And so that was a very significant revision. Here are some of these recreational and tourist service type signs that were added in the 1988 MUTCD. And after the 88 manual had been published, there was a lot of discussions within the traffic control device community about what should we be doing with the MUTCD. And there was a blue ribbon panel created in 1989 that identified shortcomings of the 88 manual and recommended that the next manual be a complete reformat and rewrite of the MUTCD. And the idea was to try and clarify a lot of the weasel words that have worked their way into the MUTCD. There were a lot of phrases like shall be permitted, or normally should, or may be required, that no one really knew whether that was a mandatory condition, a recommended condition, or an optional condition. And a lot of times it just boiled down to which lawyer was more effective at presenting it to a jury in order to determine what the meaning was. And that wasn't working for traffic engineers. So they took out all of that type of language from the manual and defined everything as a requirement, recommendation, or option. And the first step in that process was to reformat the manual. And so they took every paragraph that was in the 88 manual and formatted it as either recommended language, required, recommended, or optional language. And then went through and rewrote the words to match that formatting process. And that started in the early 1990s. There were numerous proposed rules on the MUTCD during the decade of the 90s. And in 2000, the Millennium Edition of the MUTCD was published. This was the completely reformatted and rewritten MUTCD that was significantly different from its predecessor in 1988. One of the big changes was that the MUTCD changed from a 6-inch wide, 9-inch tall document to an 8.5 by 11-inch size document. It was the very first one to be posted on the internet, and to this day the MUTCD is available on the MUTCD website for anyone that wants to download it, and that is at no cost. There were some challenges associated with the 2000 MUTCD, though. There were numerous editorial and technical errors in this edition. They put out an errata shortly after it was published, but the errata was not able to address all of the changes. In order to fix those, they needed to do rulemaking. There was also a revision that came out shortly after it was published that was very focused on just accessible pedestrian signals. There were, as I said, some significant changes in this manual. It was quite a bit different from the 88 version. Of course, the big one was that it had a new structure. Every paragraph was labeled as a standard guidance option or support paragraph. They added a new part to the MUTCD on low volume roads. They also added a new part on highway light rail transit grade crossings. They deleted the part that was labeled islands that had been in the MUTCD since 1935. They added a section that is just definitions, and This was the first MUTCD to be issued as a metric document. So the primary set of units in the MUTCD were the SI system. This MUTCD is the first one to establish a legibility index for signs, and that was 40 feet per inch. In other words, for every inch of letter height, you could read it from 40 feet away. One of the challenges is that the sign graphics were not correct. This U.S. route marker on the left uses an incorrect shape for the shield, incorrect font for the letters, and so they didn't look right. The one on the right is the way it should have looked. They eliminated or deleted the what many called the crow's foot sign, which is the W4-2 lane reduction sign. They changed the crosswalk sign. Prior to the 2000 edition, there were two versions of this. One of those versions had two horizontal lines in it that symbolized the crosswalk itself. But road users couldn't tell the difference between the advanced sign without the crosswalk lines and the sign at the crosswalk with the crosswalk lines. And so they eliminated the crosswalk lines and started using the diagonal down arrow for the pedestrian crossing itself. They added the yield line marking. These are sometimes called shark's teeth marking. They also added a section on in-roadway lights. Because of the errors and shortcomings in the 2000 manual, FHWA put out a new edition of the manual in 2003. This is the shortest amount of time between any two editions of the MUTCD. And so in this edition, they had a lot of editorial improvements to address some of those problems. They fixed all the graphics. They made technical corrections. They did add a little bit of new material, but not a huge amount. And one of the things they did was actually reduce the number of pages in the manual. They went from almost 1,000 pages to about 750 pages, and they did this by changing the margins, eliminating a lot of white space, and using a smaller font. It was revised 2 times. In both cases, these revisions came about because they were directed by Congress. Now, here are a few changes that did occur in the 2009 manual. They did reintroduce what we had called the crow's foot sign, but it was a little bit different graphic. They changed the sign that is used to inform a road user of a change in the speed limits, and it went from a regulatory sign that said speed zone ahead or reduced speed ahead to this warning sign with the speed limit sign embedded within the yellow diamond. They introduced the pink or fluorescent pink sign for incident management. They added the countdown pedestrian signals, which tell you how much time you have left to cross the road. They added metric signs with metric units on the face of the sign. Although the 2000 manual was a metric document with respect to dimensions, none of the signs in the 2000 manual actually had metric legends, and they addressed that in the 2003 manual. They also began to address the issue of accessibility in work zones so that people that had mobility impairments would be able to work their way through a work zone or temporary traffic control zone. And as I said, 2 revisions. One of them dealt with pharmacy signing and was directed by Congress to do that. The other addressed minimum sign retroreflectivity, also came about in response to direction from Congress. And then the 2009 manual, which is our current manual, was published in late 2009. The rulemaking for this particular edition received more comments than any other manual that had ever been proposed. There are over 1,800 individual letters, and when you break down all the comments contained in each of those letters, it totaled to over 15,000 comments. And in the final rule itself, it lists 611 significant changes between the 2003 and 2009 MUTCDs. So there were some philosophical changes in the 2009 manual. A few of those are increased emphasis on uniformity, trying to promote the complete street concept that provides for all road users, trying to address the needs of the aging road user population, and to provide a little more opportunity for innovation with respect to traffic control devices. This manual is much more specific than previous manuals. There was a reduction in many of the options that were available for traffic control devices, and in some cases increased specificity as for what was required or recommended. They restructured compliance dates, and compliance dates are when changes in the manual have to actually be complied with, and an emphasis on making sure that whenever you do a systematic upgrade of your devices that you bring them into compliance with the manual. They combined the railroad and light rail grade crossing parts that in the 2003 manual had been separate parts. They combined those together into a single part, and they also specified that the MUTCD applies to private property that is open to public travel. And so things like yellow pavement markings on the pavement within a shopping center parking lot are no longer considered appropriate. They need to comply with those requirements that are in the MUTCD, which in this example would be white markings. And they added some new content. Some of that dealt with managed lanes and toll roads, and it introduced the use of the color purple to deal with electronic toll tag collection. And for the first time, added content to the MUTCD dealing with the design and operation of changeable message signs. A few other key changes associated with the 2009 manual. It's the first version of the manual to actually have numbered paragraphs. The guidance statements were italicized, and since the United States did not go metric, they got rid of the metric units that were in the MUTCD in their two previous editions. When it was originally published, the 2009 manual included a statement that said, standard statements shall not be modified or compromised based on engineering judgment or engineering study. And I'll talk about how that was addressed in one of the manual revisions here in just a minute. It changed the legibility index from the 40 feet per inch that was in the 2003 manual to 30 feet per inch. It increased the required size for a lot of signs. A good example of that is the size of stop signs increased from 30 inches to 36 inches in many situations. It increased requirements for the use of one-way signs. It increased the requirements for the use of signs that warn of changes in horizontal alignment, turn and curve signs, and made them required signs in certain situations. It introduced the arrow per lane guide sign and made that a required sign for new installations. And it also addressed the use of high visibility safety garments and has specific requirements for what type of these garments are acceptable to be using within the right-of-way, and also specifies that everyone that is a worker that is within the right-of-way has to wear these types of documents, including someone from the media that's there to report on a crash scene, or a tow truck driver, or any number of other workers. They changed the rules for school signs. Previously, school signs could be the yellow, green, or the yellow. With the 2009 manual, they're required to use only the yellow-green color. And they changed the rules for ending a school speed limit. In prior manuals, you could just put up a speed limit sign to indicate the end of a school speed zone. With the 2009 manual, you have to have the end school zone sign to indicate the end of that school zone. And on grade crossings that had no active control, in other words, no flashing lights or arms, now you end up needing to put up either a yield sign or a stop sign at these grade crossings. There were a number of changes to traffic signals. The 2009 manual limited the use of 8-inch signal indications to some very, very limited and specific situations. Requires a signal head for each lane on a roadway when the speed is 45 miles an hour or higher. It also requires back plates. It is specifying the use of the flashing yellow arrow for left turns. This is a treatment that was researched in the 90s and throughout the early 2000s, and finally implemented in the 2009 manual. No longer can you use the green ball for a yield movement within a left turn signal head. And it also introduced what's called the pedestrian hybrid beacon, or the hawk signal, for pedestrian crossings. It has been revised once. I made reference to this first revision, and that's where they addressed that definition of a standard and deleted that statement that was in the original 2009 manual that says standard statements shall not be modified. They also restored language to the 2009 manual that says that the manual is not a substitute for engineering judgment. And these two changes combined allow deviations from a standard statement in limited site-specific situations where it's appropriate to do so and where it's documented in an engineering study. The second revision that came out at the same time changed compliance dates. In fact, they deleted most of the compliance dates that were in the original 2009 manual, and of the ones they retained, the dozen they retained, they actually modified the dates for several of those. That's where we are today on the history of the MUTCD. We're looking at the future of the manual and hope to have a video on that at some point in the future. If you find this material interesting and would like to get some more information about it, I'd encourage you to go to my MUTCD history website page, and you can find that by just entering Gene Hawkins MUTCD history into your search engine, and there you'll find PDFs of this presentation. You'll find some articles I wrote about 20 years ago on the history of the early MUTCDs, and you'll also find scans of all of the earlier editions of the MUTCD. And I encourage you to visit that website and send me messages if you have suggestions for improving it. And to wrap things up, I want to point out a few signs that I hope we never find in the MUTCD. These are signs that for one reason or another I would not want to see out on the roadway.